Okay, I think it's recording now. Yes. Thank you everyone for coming to this event. This is the Transnational and Situated series I'm hosting at the School of Humanities at Shanghai Jiao Tong University. This is actually the first event of the series this year. We have had 10 lectures in the past 2 years, and it's been very fruitful. And today's guest, John Solomon, is someone I've always been wanting to invite for this series, and he is a very productive scholar, very insightful in a lot of current affairs, but also the larger field of China studies as well. And since I am mostly doing my teaching at SJTU in the Modern Chinese Studies MA program involving a lot of international students, I think it is only fitting to invite Professor Solomon to share his insights on China studies as a field for us. So today's format, we will just have 15 minutes of his talk, and then we will have a Q&A session, and everything is recorded, and we might upload the recording to the internet later, so just be aware of that. So let me just briefly introduce Professor Solomon a little bit. Professor John Solomon is a professor of Chinese in Lyon 3 in France, and hosts many other posts in other universities in France. And he studied at Cornell and lived in East Asia for 25 years, Europe for 14, and North America for 23. It's very impressive. And he is competent in Chinese, Japanese, French, and English. Truly multilingual scholar. And he's recently published 2 books, one on Taiwan and the other on Hong Kong. The Taiwan one is called The Taiwan Consensus and the Ethos of Area Studies in Pax Americana, Spectral Transitions with Palgrave in 2023. And the Hong Kong one is in Chinese. It's called The Genealogy of Defeat of the Left, Translation, Transition, and Bordering in the Hong Kong Anti-ELAP Movement. 左翼败北的系谱翻译转型与边界 published by Tangshan Shudian in Taiwan. And he is working on a lot of other topics now, including Black communism and a art catalog for ceremony burial of the undead world, and a new manuscript on Foucault and related to the topic of genocide. And I guess it's related to the current affairs. If you search him online on YouTube, you'll find a recent interview he did on a similar topic, very insightful, very provocative in many ways. Anyways, so without further ado, let's welcome Professor Solomon to give us his speech, and please prepare your questions in the process as well. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Flair, for the introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm really so sorry about the misunderstanding about the time. So I prepared a PowerPoint to accompany my talk. My talk is titled "The Political Unconscious of Global China Studies." I'm not sure how long it'll go. We'll see. Hopefully we can have an exchange at the end if you have questions, or if the talk, not necessarily a question, but causes you to think and associate with something else that's been of concern to you that you want to explore, that also could be a very interesting way to approach it. So let me just share my PowerPoint with you. Hopefully this will work. There we go. Now what I'd also like to do is to be able to see myself at the same time. Let's see if I can, yes, that works. Okay. So, okay. The Political Unconscious of Global China Studies. I want to start off with some terms and definitions. First of all, let me do this in this way, because then we can, there you go, full screen. Great. Okay, so I'm using 2 terms, global China studies, which I distinguish from offshore China studies. I'm going to explain both of those and the relation between them. and also a little bit about the political unconscious, where it comes from, and I think the idea behind it will become very clear as I go through the presentation. So first, offshore versus global China studies. Okay, offshore China studies is really the beginning of China studies. Of course, China studies is a fairly new discipline. It'd be very interesting if we had the time to really go into the genealogy and the historical birth of this field. It begins really after the end of World War II, where you have a lot of people who were either involved with US intelligence, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, or they were like my teacher. One of the first teachers I had to learn Chinese was a Marine in Beijing, stationed in Beijing right after World War II, before 1949 liberation. And missionaries, the usual suspects. And it was basically formed in of course, how should we say this? In the 19th century, the classic European model of the modern university was divided, of course, between the hard sciences and then the human sciences. And in the human sciences, basically the divisions in the human sciences were all more or less an outgrowth or developed out of the old discipline of philology, which is a colonial discipline that gave birth to anthropology, linguistics, sociology. These are the main, history and then literature. These are the main disciplines. If you go to most European universities today, they preserve this structure. But if you look at universities in the Anglophone world, particularly the United States, North America, you'll see that there's a proliferation of what are called studies programs that really begins starting in the 1940s. And the first one of these, I believe, is American Studies, which is then kind of co-figured against other studies, beginning Black studies and then area studies. And the relation between these is very important. That it's all part of the settler imperial polity that the United States is, or has been since the colonization and founding of the United States. And so offshore China studies comes out of that genealogy, and then it's in particular is it's born out of the needs of one, the national security state, and also the need of simply at the end of World War II, and the United States emerges as one of the primary victors of World War II. We'll talk about that in a little bit further in the talk. Of course, the Soviet Union as well, and China. But the United States has confronted them with being a global power and having to figure out how to kind of manage this position, which is basically an imperial position into which it's been thrust. And so China studies, the birth of China studies is related to the whole problem of the global governmentality as a problem of American hegemony, US hegemony in the post-World War II period. This configuration of offshore China studies lasts for a number of decades. It's hard to say exactly when it ends. I've picked 1989 for reasons that'll become evident a little bit later on. global China studies really begins in the 1980s, and it's associated with a whole number of other political and economic phenomena that we would normally call just globalization. This global China studies configuration is the configuration that we are in today. There's a important continuity between offshore China studies and global China studies, and there are some important differences as well. One should not simply imagine that this is just a, let's say, Western or US phenomenon. For reasons that I'll make clear as I go through this. Global Chinese studies in particular is an international configuration. And in fact, probably the majority of practitioners in this disciplinary field today, it's quite large now, are not people who would normally be associated with being sutured to either whiteness or, Western origin. Okay. So offshore China studies, I've tried to simplify it into a number of different elements. Like every discipline, like every academic discipline, it is based on a number of different core principles, including founding exclusions. You really can't have a discipline without certain kinds of exclusions, although the kinds of exclusions that constitute offshore China studies are highly politicized. First of all, anti-communism. Why anti-communism? Particularly because of the construction of US secular democracy, which is, in other words, a racialized democracy. That's not denying the fact that it is a certain kind of democracy, but it's qualifying it as a secular democracy. And it's a racialized one. And the basis for that racialized settler democracy is private property. So that's where really the impetus for anti-communism comes from, because anti-communism is a way to preserve white hegemony, which is the basis of the settler colonial society established in the United States. Hence, there's a fundamental connection between anti-communism and anti-Blackness, both domestically and internationally. Now, in terms of methodologies, offshore China studies was for a long time characterized by an investment in modernization theory, which was dominant in the 1950s and into the 1960s, and then largely got discredited afterwards, but still continues very much in some ways, in important ways, to be a kind of horizon or a series of presuppositions for what study of other parts of the world should be like and should be about. Along with this modernization theory orientation was a kind of general disposition which could be described as anti-theoretical. When I began my PhD study, my graduate study in modern Chinese literature in 1986 at Cornell University, it was not considered normal that you would go and start reading contemporary thought, what was at that time in the United States called theory. There was a very clear anti-theory bias in China studies at that time. And then there was also a generalized repression of the field's investment in aesthetic modernity. That's really something that I would love to talk about. I think it really deserves a presentation, a separate presentation on its own. I didn't put it into this presentation because I'm not sure there'll be time, and I certainly would love to talk more about that, but I was afraid of it being just too much. But this is an important part of the story of the Constitution of China Studies, and why China Studies, offshore China Studies, has a particular sort of blind spot about the formation of Chinese revolutionary thought, particularly Chinese socialist aesthetics, Chinese socialist realism, which have really been given short shrift in China studies for a very long time. Then there are also the institutional parameters of offshore China studies. I mentioned the connection with the national security state. And another part, which I think is actually really the most important part of not just China studies, but area studies in general, is subjective formation. Normally we think of these disciplines or fields as, what do? They're producing knowledge. That's their main product, right? That's what they do. But actually, I think we should kind of turn that around and really begin to look at it in terms of what kinds of people are they producing, right? Now, the subjective formation for offshore China studies, which is quite different from the subjective formation really in global China studies, was mostly populated by people who are what I would call the self-whitified. They imagine themselves as being white, and they're also largely heterosexual male. And there won't be time to talk about this too much, but the whites, those people who imagine themselves as white, imagine their whiteness as being the absence of color, which then gives them access to a universal view because they're not burdened by any kind of particular quality of having some kind of colorization. So whiteness is the absence of color, but that absence means that one therefore can have a kind of universal view that those who are colorized would not be able to access. Now, global China studies is a very different configuration in a lot of ways. First of all, there is a much broader acceptance of theory into the field, but unfortunately, the acceptance of theory, this is a whole problem in itself, and I think it's very, very complicated. What I really want to do is contextualize that introduction or acceptance of theory into the field of global China studies, which had always been deeply hostile towards theory, more in terms of globalization and material processes associated with globalization, particularly financialization, and the transformation of the university that begins to occur with globalization from an elite university that was limited really to reproducing social elites, to a much broader university. It has been called a democratized university. I'm not sure that's the best way to phrase it, especially because it's become increasing, because the hierarchy doesn't disappear. The hierarchy simply gets diversified, and you get ever more finely nuanced gradation within the hierarchy, and the creation of what Stefano Harney, I think, was the first to call the logistical university, which is the university that's dealing with flows and transfers, knowledge transfer flows, capital flows, knowledge flows, intellectual property rights, and also particularly flows of students who are also migrant labor as well. So the subjective formation in global China studies is much more associated with a much larger kind of global configuration designed to accommodate not just the co-figuration between those who imagine themselves to be white and their colored objects, or the not just objects of knowledge production, but also the objects of U.S. imperial hegemony on a global level. Now, global China studies makes some really important modifications to that. Okay, so in terms of the political unconscious, this term, it can be traced back to the American Marxist Fredric Jameson, his 1981 book, The Political Unconscious Narrative as a Socialist Symbolic Act. One thing I really want to grab out of this sprawling work is this idea that what we're really focused on are not the objects of research. So in this case, that would be, for instance, China, but on the conditions that make research of certain objects possible. In that sense, I think this project really shares a concern that is very close to that of Michel Foucault, who worked in his career to show that it's not because there are objects that you have that discipline of knowledge to study them, but it's rather in a sense, the other way around. It's because you create these disciplines that you install these disciplines that they then create these objects that they're going to study. And what the political unconscious does, or the concept of the political unconscious does, is focus on the conditions that make the research of certain objects possible. This is a quote from that book by Fredric Jameson, The Traditional Dialectical Code as the Study of Darstellung. Darstellung is that untranslatable designation in which the current problems of representation productively intersect with the quite different ones of presentation, or the essentially narrative and historical movement of language and writing through time. Now, if I were to have time to go into the crisis of aesthetic modernity, or why aesthetic modernity is a crisis, and then how offshore China studies is kind of born in a repression of aesthetic modernity, then I would be able to explain how that configuration of aesthetic modernity is particularly related to representation and presentation, particularly via the figure of man. Let's not call it man, let's call it the human. The figure of the human turns out to be a focus of central concern for revolutionary Chinese authors and philosophers and theorists in the middle of the 20th century. And this is one of the things that offshore China studies and all the way into global China studies has perennially misunderstood. The emblematic moment of misunderstanding concerning the crisis of aesthetic modernity, which is a global phenomenon that has all kinds of repercussions. The emblematic moment of this misapprehension or misunderstanding is the way offshore China studies and then global China studies looks at the famous talk given by Mao Zedong in 1942 at the Yan'an Revolutionary Base, talks at the Yan'an Forum on Art and Literature, just usually called the Yan'an talk, which offshore China studies has always presented as the origin of the politicization of culture that leads to the dictatorial command exercised by the party state on the cultural sphere and establishes the basis of 7 or 8 decades of Chinese state repression. The problem is that in this talk that Mao gives, he actually specifically and rather calculatedly refers to the discourse of figuration, or the problem of the figure of the human, as a literary problem, but it's obviously much, much bigger than a literary problem. And there was a lot of people who knew that in China. This element of Mao's intervention in 1942 has been systematically ignored. I just wanted to cite that as an example. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, okay, so we've traced out the idea of the political unconscious. We've also done a quick distinction between, charted the evolution from offshore China studies to global China studies. I want to further contextualize that now by taking a step back and getting our bearings about what modernity is. And I have a very particular way of understanding modernity, which I'm going to call the age of transition. This is coming from the idea, this is basically intuitive, that modernity is a break from what came before, right? The pre-modern. But modernity isn't just one transition. Modernity is a whole series of transitions. And this series of transitions actually forms a kind of metonymic thing. So there's a economic, or what might be called a capitalist transition from an agrarian and mercantile society to an industrial economy and then capitalist accumulation, accompanied by a political transition from kings and feudal houses to the rule of the bourgeoisie through new institutions, legal institutions, representative institutions. And there's also an epistemological transition from a kind of mythical, religious understanding of the world to a scientific, rational one. These transitions kind of become synonymous with each other and form a metonymic chain of transition. Within this idea of modernity as transition, the West occupies a very particular place, a very special place. These transitions as a whole, this metonymic chain of transition, forms what I call the presupposition of the universal transition, which is an idealized kind of Platonic model of modern transition, of modernity as transition. At its crudest basis, this is the basis for modernization theory of the 50s and 60s. And it assumes that the West has gone through this process, the West is the model of this process, hence the so-called West is also really the holder of the lineage, the holder of the knowledge about this. And it's not just the holder of knowledge, therefore, but this capacity or this qualification also is what gives the West the power to judge, in fact, not just power, but the obligation to judge, to evaluate the legitimacy of transitions among colonized and then later post-colonial populations all around the world. The first transition, the very, what we might say, primordial transition, is thus the positing of a fundamental difference between the West and its outside. There's no reason to assume this division. It has to be positive. It can't be examined empirically, which is that would be another interesting path to pursue. Why we can't come up finally with a positivist definition, an empirical definition of the West and its difference with the rest of the world. Instead, the only way that difference can be established is through an act of positing. It's a transcendental act. And this is actually the very first transition, in a sense, that makes of the West a very, very strange construction, because the West isn't then just a particular area, one area of the world that then maybe expands around the world, and through that expansion then maybe gains some kind of qualification to acquire universality. No, that's not what it is. It's rather the West is also not just a particularity, but also a kind of transcendental position. I talk about this in my book in Chinese about Hong Kong, about the West as the arbiter of universal transition. I think this is when it really first began to reveal for me, looking at the presuppositions about how politics should develop in Hong Kong. It became very evident to me that there is this kind of presupposition of a Platonic ideal model, universal transition, and it's the standard by which everywhere else around the world is judged. I developed that further in this book in English, Spectral Transitions. So then the question is, well, what is the West? I'm going to make a counterintuitive assertion that the West is not a particular region. The West is, we should rather think of as a form of social relations. It organizes social relations in a hierarchical way. It's also a way of organizing epistemological relations. And I think the primary thing to take out of this is that as a form of social relation, the West is also a tolerance. So today, I think people are very confused about this, in the sense that there has been this tendency to imagine the West as just another particular region among a series of other particular regions. And I think that that's really missing the role that the West, the so-called West, plays as the model of area generally. This also creates the West as a kind of tribunal. The West sits in judgment upon the rest of the world. Think of this in concretized fashion. Think of this in terms of the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize really is the most concrete manifestation of the West as a site of judgment. And the place where the legitimacy of transitions in other places is always evaluated and called into question. This has been one of the perennial occupations of global China studies, from offshore China studies up to global China studies. They're always pontificating about the so-called crisis of legitimacy of the party state in China. And in fact, this is a common theme for area studies in general, the crisis of legitimacy, because it's assumed that since none of the other nations of the world are really democracies in the sense that the Western liberal democracies are democracies, so they lack legitimacy. This is from Naoki Sakai's seminal article in 1987, Modernity and Critique. If you haven't read it, it's really worth reading even today, in which he describes the Nobel Prize syndrome. He doesn't use that term, of course, where he mentions that the West, this is a structural organization, the West would never be satisfied with being recognized, but would wish to recognize others. It would rather be a supplier of recognition than a receiver thereof. Think about that, and as you think about that, then begin to see the power relation that is involved in being a source of recognition rather than having other people come and say, hey, you're cool. It's much more powerful to say, you guys are cool, but the others, they're not cool. Now, China studies in the political unconscious of China studies deals with all of this in terms of the historical craft, particularly historical revisionism. Trying to keep an eye on the time here. I think the best way to access this particular question, there are many different ways to do it, but the best way to do it is to begin with the meaning of World War II. And there's a revisionist narrative. There's a revisionist narrative, which is kind of a fundamental narrative, and it's become a transnational narrative, was that World War II was fought primarily at the expense of liberal democracy against authoritarian dictatorship. Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and militaristic imperialist fascist Japan, right? That's the revisionist narrative. But what is the truth? Okay, I'm going to give you a totally different reading. And this is that World War II was the greatest colonial war in history so far. The greatest colonial war. We can distinguish in Europe between the war in the West, that is the war that Germany fought against the UK, and France, and then the United States, with the war in the East, the war against the Soviet Union, the invasion of Poland. Generally speaking, as far as the war in the West was concerned, generally speaking, the German army, the Wehrmacht, observed the rules of war. There was some violation, of course, of Belgian neutrality, Dutch neutrality. Excuse me, but there was some rhetoric of observing the Geneva Convention and the rules of war. A German scholar, about 15, 20 years ago, Wolfram Wetter, wrote a book called The Wehrmacht History, Myth, Reality, which really destroyed this myth of the, let's say, the civilized war in the West. One of the most important examples that he cites is there was about 40,000 Senegalese who fought in France in 1940. These 40,000 Senegalese became POWs, prisoners of war, and about half of them were killed after having already surrendered. They were just simply killed in cold blood by the German army. After having been separated out from the white French POWs, obviously in a racist act, racist gesture, that recalled on a small scale the entire way the war in the East was conducted. The war in the East was overtly called a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation designed to create Lebensraum, living space for colonization. The war that is being conducted in Gaza today is being called by some very courageous Germans Vernichtungskrieg. I'm thinking of Melanie Schweitzer. She was a civil servant in Germany who quit her post, I guess about a year ago, in ethical protest over unquestioning German support and silencing of internal dissent in Germany to protest the war of annihilation being conducted by Israel in Gaza. The strange thing is the revisionist history has really become dominant in the collective West. If you ask people today who defeated the Nazis in the Anglophone, the United States and the UK, they're going to say it was the United States, not the Soviet Union. Whereas right at the end of the war, Americans and British were pretty clear, because it was undeniable that the Soviet Union had fought the brunt of the war, had taken the brunt of the punishment, and it destroyed the dominant part of the German army. There is another poll in the UK. Okay, there's UK citizens thinking that it was the United Kingdom. It was England that defeated Nazi Germany. And then after that, the United States and France, and only 6% think it was the Soviet Union. Wow. That's pretty impressive, the effects of revisionism. The fact is, okay, here is the German ground force, the battalion of German dead, wounded, and missing. 80% of the German army was destroyed on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviet Union. The rest on all the other fronts amounted to less than 20%. I leave you to conclude who defeated the Nazis. It's important, though, because both the Soviet Union and China paid a huge price to defeat the global fascist alliance. World War II deaths among these two countries dwarfed the deaths by, among other allied nations. This is continually forgot in the revisionist history. But why does this matter? So what? Okay, so these Western countries, 60, 70 years after the end of World War II have kind of, given into this kind of self-glorification. And so as far as they're concerned, they won the war, they beat the Nazis. But okay, what does it really matter? It matters because this really deeply influences how we see the post-war global order established under U.S. hegemony. And this is really what forms the basis of the political and concept of global China studies, inherited from offshore China. This is the creation of the image of the U.S. as an anti-fascist, anti-colonial power, when in fact it is neither. The elements that contributed to this fake image of the U.S. as anti-fascist, anti-colonial, democratic power. First of all, the criminalization of communism. Very shortly after the war began it was really with Hannah Arendt's book in 1950, The Origins of Totalitarianism, where you begin to see in the third part of that book the establishment of equivalence between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which erases a number of really important fundamental differences, among which probably the most important difference is that Nazism was overtly, self-declaredly a colonial project. It was modeled self-consciously on U.S. settler colonialism. Prior to the war, the Nazis sent German legal experts to the United States to study the racist Jim Crow laws in each state as the basis for the Nuremberg laws. Some of the German Nazi jurors were even shocked by the extremity of the Jim Crow laws, the racist Jim Crow laws in the United States. The Soviet Union, for all its faults, was anti-colonial. What happens is that World War II, the way World War II is understood, erases the continuum from U.S. settled colonialism to Nazi settler colonialism and creates instead a facade. This is what also enables the United States after the end of World War II to then begin to incorporate the remnants of Nazism into the U.S. global hegemony. A number of a number of former Nazis were played important roles in the post-war global order. Werner von Braun, the scientist, was head of NASA. Walter Haustein was head of the EU Commission. Adolf Hitler, who is shown here standing next to Adolf Hitler, became NATO's chief of staff. And in fact, for I think a decade and a half, NATO was run by former Nazis. Kurt Waldheim became Secretary General in 19. Basically, what's being covered up is the lawless side of what Aaron Good has been called the tripartite state. The three sides of the post-war U.S. state. There's the settler democracy side, and this is normally what we think of, and we don't even think of it normally as settler democracy. We usually think of it as a democracy, highly pluralistic, giving power to the people. In the transition from offshore China studies to global China studies, there was a critique of the relation between China studies and the national security state. So there has been in China studies some critical reflections on the first two of the sides of these three sides of the post-war U.S. state. But what there hasn't been in either offshore China studies or global China studies is a critical reflection on the covert state, the deep state, the lawless state, which actually plays a very, very important role on the periphery and the borderland of China, which is one of the sources today, which is the major source today of contention about the legitimacy of the People's Republic of China and CPC's rule, right? The idea that China is a colonial power, that today's modern China is a colonial power exercising colonial control over peripheral borderlands that are the site of genocidal acts. Some go so far as to really call that really unqualified genocide. Others have taken a somewhat more distant to qualifying it as a cultural genocide in places like Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia, as well as Sinophone peripheries like Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. If we had the time, we could consider that lawlessness, the secret lawlessness of the U.S., the post-war U.S. state for the 7 or 8 decades since 1945 up to the present, with specific examples. I have 2 photos here. One, the top one is Rusi Nazar. Rusi Nazar is Kazakh. No, sorry, Uzbeki. Uzbeki fought for a few weeks in the Red Army, was captured by the Germans, became a German officer who was involved in the organization. It was about 200,000 to 300,000 Muslims who were organized into a Muslim division to fight the Soviet Union. After the Second World War, Rusi Nazar was hired by the CIA and stationed in Turkey, which is the origin of the term, where Rufi Nazar orchestrated covert operations both in Central Asia, the Central Asian Republic of the Soviet Union, as well as throughout the rest of the Middle East, where the US was conducting operations basically that I think Vincent Bevan, in his book, The Jakarta Method, will later call the genocide of the left in the Muslim world, and then that becomes just a general plan of US post-war global governance, the genocide of the left. Another figure who played an important role in that was Reinhard Gehlen. Reinhard Gehlen led a Nazi spy ring in World War II in the Soviet Union, in the East, in the colonial war in the East. And after the end of World War II, he and his entire spy ring were hired by the CIA. They formed the core of the new intelligence agency of the Federal Republic of Germany after World War II, and they just continued their operations without missing a beat. We can also then go and look at some connections in Taiwan, which Taiwan at that time was a major player in the global fascist anti-communist front in the Cold War. Global, Chiang Kai-shek was one of the organizers of the World Anti-Communist League that joined East European diaspora, fascist diaspora, Latin American fascists, and East Asian fascists. Here in this picture, what we see there on the right is Theodor Oberlander. Theodor Oberlander is the Nazi German guy who began as his career as an area studies expert. He was an area studies expert specialized in the East, in Ostasyon, the Eastern research on East Europe and Russia. And he's the guy who, in 1941, when the German army invaded the Soviet Union, set up the National Battalion of Ukrainian fascist nationalists who were fighting the Soviet Union. After the war, Oberlander was hired by Konrad Adenauer in 1952-53 to be the minister of repatriated Germans. But basically, Adenauer is the German prime minister who establishes the rehabilitation of Nazis with U.S. blessing, of course. Oberlander, next to, across from Oberlander with the big circle is Yaroslav Stetsko. He's Ukrainian, and his wife. They're visiting Kinmen in 1969. Now, the funny thing about this particular picture is both Oberlander and Stetsko were in Lvov in 1941. In the end of, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd. The Russian lines collapsed. The German army took over Lvov at the end of June, and then there were some important massacres of Jews and Poles that occurred at this time. Stetsko is called the butcher of Lvov. Oberlander was in Lvov at the time, overseeing the Ukrainian National. There's some controversy in the historical record about whether Oberlander was involved in the massacre of Jews and Poles. But anyway, both of these guys who were involved in this massacre in 1941 at the end of June and early July are there in 1969 in Kinmen, Taiwan. And then here's another couple other Nazis. One guy one guy from the Ministry of Propaganda who worked with Joseph Goebbels. They're visiting Taiwan. Here's another Ukrainian diaspora figure, Professor Lev Dobryansky. He's shaking hands with Chiang Kai-shek in Taipei. Dobryansky was involved in the World Anti-Communist League. He's also the fellow, he played a very important role in organizing the Ukrainian fascist anti-communist diaspora in North America that was relocated to North America after World War II. And he created what was called National Captive Nation Speech, which is basically behind the idea that has taken hold, has been institutionalized in the United States, that the United States as an anti-colonial power has an obligation to decolonize first the Soviet Union and then today decolonize Russia, the Russian Federation. So he was involved in that, Dobryansky, both rehabilitating Nazis and setting a institutional precedent for the neocon balkanization of European territory. What's interesting about this is that there's his daughter. This is in 2023. His daughter, Paula Dobryansky. I think it's July 23rd, I think. 2023. She's shaking hands with the foreign minister in Taiwan, Joseph Wu, now appointed by the DPP. The DPP is supposed to be the party that is signals a break with the authoritarian fascist rule, the authoritarian rule of Chiang Kai-shek. But there is Joseph Wu, who's a member of this party, representative of this party, and also a public official, shaking hands with the daughter of a guy who was shaking hands and a collaborator of Generalissimo Jia. Right? Nobody in the Taiwan media sphere, the Taiwan commentariat, mentioned the genealogical connection between Lev and Paula and the DPP's role in the continuity of fascist anti-communism. Paula was there as a member of the neoconservative think tank in the United States, Center for a New American Century. So I'm not sure how much time I have, and this is all takes much longer than I thought it would. I've identified two disciplinary norms that are essential for the construction of the political unconscious in global China studies. That is the norm of not noticing and the norm of active forgetting. Now I want to get the challenge for global China studies today as I see it. Okay, I'm going to contrast my position with that of a group called the Critical China Scholars, who recently published a syllabus which really suggests that their main mission today is to fight what they see as the rise of Sinophobia. And I think everybody can agree that it's a very serious problem, and also expose Chinese state repression. For my part, I look at this in a very different way, and I still think that the most important goal and challenge for global China studies today is epistemic decolonization, particularly confronting what area is in China studies' role in this infrastructural thing that I call narrative. Fabio Lanza wrote a book, The End of Concern, Maoist China Activism and Asian Studies. He's one of the members of the Critical China Scholars, in which you see the description of a historical evolution from an orientalist objectivation of the other to a progressive recognition of the agency of the other. This leads Lanza to celebrate the new situation in which now China scholars have transitioned to working with Chinese instead of on them. I think this celebratory attitude hides the reasons, the material reasons for this evolution. It's not a progressive evolution. Well, in short, not objectivizing the other and then attributing agency to the other. Of course, that is an improvement. But it's the basis for that transition, that transformation, is a material change in the basis of American global hegemony in the era commonly called globalization. At a methodological level, we can summarize this problem by the idea that agency, as important as it is always downstream of subjectivation that have always occurred with a materialization. In other words, a slave has agency. So China studies is part of an apparatus of dispositive area. An area is different from territoriality. Area it includes material and immaterial practices, basically what I call bordering practices, of which translation is a primary example in the way elaborated and understood by Naoki Sakai as a social practice, not a linguistic practice. So what is China studies? Well, China studies is a component of the apparatus area and anthropological difference. So it's not something that's just done by people in the West. It's a transnational configuration. And it would be very interesting to talk about the transformation of significant parts of Chinese academia in the People's Republic of China in the reform period since 1979 to reorient significant parts of the humanities in China along the basis of the political unconscious in global China studies. I think that's as far as I can take it, and that's already been like an hour. Instead of stop here, I want to thank you for your patience and for listening this far. I'm going to stop here, and perhaps now we can have a conversation if you have some questions or would like to share something.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Solomon, for the very insightful talk. And I think it really helps me to thread together the different writings that I've read, the different writings you've done that I've read. So I guess I will try to ask some questions when people are preparing theirs. So you can either type in your questions in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand function, and then I will unmute you just to be more orderly. So otherwise people just keep unmuting themselves. That's not very helpful. So yeah, you can use both functions to ask questions. So anyways, I will just use the privilege of the host to ask some questions that I've always had because I engage with Professor Solomon's writings and thoughts in quite episodic or sporadic ways. And the first time I kind of see the common thread in how you think about these very crucial issues, and they are all very linked together. So I do have a lot of questions. So for example, the first one I want to ask is, then within this framework, that this is a quite existential question. related to how we do China studies, if at all, right? So we are aware through your talk and through your work and now Ki Saikai's work that China studies as area studies is very problematic. It has an imperial origin, continues to operate in this epistemic colonization, like you say. But then how does one speak about certain injustices that still happen in China, let's admit, like as anywhere else? Okay, let's not exceptionalize this. Is it possible to speak about these injustices in the framework of China studies at all, or do we just do away with the framework and then address them in relation to other justices elsewhere? So how do we actually do China criticism, let's say? Okay, and then that's the first one. And then the second one is also about this possibility to salvage some sort of China studies in today's framework. For example, the work I'm doing, I'm kind of forced to do this, okay, but because we have this program. But it's interesting, you know, when you say offshore China studies, global China studies, I think, okay, obviously we're not offshore, we're doing China studies in China, but we do it in English, we do it internationally. I can set up the same program probably in Oxford if they allow me, right? So I'm just wondering the location of this China studies, to what extent does this matter? Because if we do China studies within China, we have to operate within certain intellectual parameters, perhaps censorship, things like that, right? So is it even possible to do some kind of productive China studies in a non-offshore way? Okay, that's the second kind of existential question. And then the final one, okay, just the final related one that's probably more practical is, you know, in today's world, it's very ironic when you speak about how globalization or this post-war US-led war order is very much tied to this incorporation of the Nazis or incorporation of this anti-communist rightist forces, okay? And we can clearly see that in all the incidents you mentioned, all the pictures you've brought up. But today, it's very ironic that Trump is trying to do away with globalization. A lot of the things he's done is trying to abandon globalization, at least on the surface, right? Maybe while trying to keep the US hegemony. But on the surface, he is really moving away from globalization as we have always known it. And at the same time, China is very eager, at least the government, okay, is very eager to embrace globalization as to step up to at least appear as a full supporter of continued globalization through things like One Belt, One Road and through continued engagement with Europe, for example. So how do we actually judge the current stage of globalization we are in now and its relation to China and the anti-communist histories of China studies? So those are some of the questions I've always had, and I hope you can probably illuminate us on this.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. There, each one of them is really big. I'll try to I'll do my best to address them. In terms of the injustices in China and how one should address that, let me just cite one example. That of the book from 2020 by Margaret Hillenbrand, a UK-based scholar, called Negative Exposures, Knowing What Not to Know in Contemporary China. Knowing What Not to Know in Contemporary China. The problem that I have with reading that book is that when one looks at the formation of the political unconscious in global China studies, there is a problem of what I call the epistemology of the secret. This is something that I wrote about in the book Spectral Transitions, and I've continued to think about it more since then. It's a problem that's internal to global China studies, and it's one of the reasons why global China studies has never come to terms with that third element of the tripartite state that I mentioned in my presentation, that of lawlessness. For instance, I've read assiduously the work of specialists of Xinjiang and Uyghur specialists in the West who regularly comment on the problem of whether there was a Uyghur separatist movement and whether the Uyghur separatist movement was responsible for terrorism, and that thus posed a real threat to the Chinese state, the CRC state. And overwhelmingly, the consensus in the literature that I've read is that whatever terrorism occurred is a reaction to state repression, mounting state repression, for which the Beijing government, the central government, bears full responsibility. So there's a clear causal relationship asserted there. Now, what I never see them talk about, I've never seen them, and it was particularly evident, for instance, John Roberts' book, The War on the Uyghurs, in which he acknowledges a link between what he calls the war on the Uyghurs executed by Beijing central government and the global war on terror, the GWAT, the global war on terror. What he never does, though, is look at the way the global war on terror was also directed against China, against the CRC. It becomes somewhat more visible in the Trump 2.0 period because of the fall of the Assad government in Syria that exposed some of the earlier CIA operations, particularly Operation Sycamore Timber, if I can remember correctly, Operation Sycamore Timber, in which a Uyghur contingent, Uyghur jihadis based in Italy and supported by Turkey played the central role in toppling the Assad regime. And then later in massacring the minority Alawites on the coast who had been traditionally a population supporter, state support for Assad. So anyway, all this is just to say that there is this refusal to come to terms with the secret lawless element of U.S. global hegemony that's inscribed in the discipline of global China studies in a number of different ways. I can't enumerate them all. It's in my book, if that interests you. That bear finally on what Margaret Hillenbrand kind of naively calls knowing what not to know in China. Because there's a very complex dialectical play between knowing what not to know in China studies, which is political unconscious, and knowing what not to know in China. Now, I would, as a problem of knowledge, which is not really all I'm qualified to talk about, I would look at that as a single entity, a relationship composed of different parts. So if I was going to take on the kind of issue that Margaret Hillenbrand does in this book, I'm not doing that kind of work. I would have to go and do a whole bunch of new research. But if I were going to undertake that kind of project, I would definitely incorporate into my project a parallel project in which I am looking at what you should not know, knowing what not to know in China studies, and then more generally in the under global white hegemony, craft term. So, of course, censorship is a real problem. It's becoming a problem now everywhere. And I think the events of the last, particularly the last 3 years, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and now with the war of annihilation in Gaza, where we've seen in the so-called, in the collective West, where we've seen really heavy-handed censorship taking place. I think it's becoming clear that a lot of the stuff that was written over the last 2 decades in China studies about censorship and repression in China was pretty darn one-sided and naive. In terms of the problem of globalization in the context of Trump, that is a very important problem. I think, if you'll allow me, I'd like to just leave that aside for a moment and address, I think, a couple of the questions that are in the chat, because they're kind of more related specifically to the first 2 questions, Flair, that you asked.
Yeah, so I've invited Noah to turn on the camera, and maybe you can speak. You can ask the question yourself. I think you are unmuted.
Yeah, I can try, but I can't actually see the question I asked, so I just have to kind of guess. I can't work out how to get it in the chat.
I could read it for you.
Okay, please do.
So, I would like to ask if you could clarify about the surveys about who did the most work for ending World War II. I'm uncertain how this USA, UK centrism is related specifically to China, rather than just being a single manifestation of a general problem in that domain.
Yes. I can.
Did you want to add anything to that? Or? I mean,
so
it's pretty clear to me.
Related to your mentioning about the sort of diminishing of the role of China in this situation, but I'm not sure if that's like you were trying to say that this is specifically an intent to diminish the role of China and therefore have something to do with studying China as a domain, or whether it's more to do with this kind of more modern narrative, like the World War II narrative, where you have like the Churchill and the Bluestone and America.
Yeah, that's a very important question. Thanks a lot. Basically, it comes down to the effacement or the erasure of the continuity of colonialism, the persistence of colonial relationships into the present. So this revisionist narrative, this revisionist historical narrative about what World War II was about is kind of the cornerstone of a larger effacement of the coloniality of the West. I mean, the truth is that the West, the various nations of the West, each in their own with specific details, have never gone through a process of decolonization. I mean, for the Black Panthers in the United States, it was absolutely essential to go through a process of decolonization. For them meant rewriting the Constitution, because the Constitution is what is the basis for white hegemony in the United States, right? So the only way to end that is to open a constitutional convention, which is one of the really brilliant ideas advocated by the Black Panthers. Opening a constitutional convention, of course, in the current reactionary climate of the United States, suggesting that you want to touch the sacred document, the U.S. Constitution, would be right. I mean, that in terms of mainstream politics, that's political suicide, right? You'd be instantly called un-American. And you could probably be deported by ICE. Right? So that's why I think it's important to go back and look at this revisionist historical narrative of World War II that's taken hold in the collective West, but also really to a large extent in China as well. I think to a large extent, Chinese have become avid consumers of the mythology or the fantasy of the West. And so that's a real, not all, but that's a real problem.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a second question by Ting Ting from Renmin University. Yes. Maybe you can ask it yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Professor Solomon. I didn't know I needed to show my face. So anyway, thank you for your great lecture. And because I also like teach the courses on literary history. So I'm very fascinated about your criticism towards the revisionist narrative of history that is catered to the US hegemony. But I'm also interested, like, what is your view on the way of like forming a literary history that for me may not be possible to be devoid of a certain kind of centrism, either Eurocentrism or Sinocentrism. So I wonder, like, if we're to, like, we constantly criticize such kind of centrism, like, would there be the alternative way of writing a different kind of literary history? Or like, who would be the agent of that? And would that be something you're proposing? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a really burning question for a lot of people, and I have really thought about that in terms of I don't think the main task for us today is to combat centrism in general. I have a lot of friends who they think that's their main thing. They're against all centrism, whatever sense. When I began to look at that problem more closely, I began to see behind the critique of centrism all these secret ways, the unsuspecting ways in which the critique of centrism is actually then has a link to the narrative of historical revisionism that I was alluding to in my talk. One of them, of course, would be in terms of what I called, and I think in my talk, projects of balkanization and abstraction. Because whenever centrism is mentioned, it's usually applied, the greatest force is always applied to peer competitors of the United States, particularly the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. There is some lip service paid to Eurocentrism, but particularly in China studies, and this is a very interesting phenomenon. We could go and talk about it in various different methodologies, different disciplines. But there is in China studies often one reads, particularly like if you consult the literature about Han chauvinism, which is a big topic in Western studies of China, Han chauvinism, is that they assume, it's taken for granted that the West has already kind of done a self-critique of its own Eurocentrism. And you can even the most egregious example. What's that fellow's name? Oh, it's a good thing I forgot. So glad I forgot his name. But you can read a scholar in the field who will say, you know, the West has already deconstructed itself, but China hasn't. And I think that's indicative of a couple things. One, of a very, very juvenile understanding of what deconstruction is. Deconstruction is never really an operation that's exercised by a subject on an object. Deconstruction is always involves a relationship. It involves two terms, and it is something that acts on each of those terms, whether they want it to or not. It's not related to the volition of the subject, which is why it's so deconstructed, and it destabilizes the relation, which you know, in a lot of the criticism of whatever centrism today, what people are really looking for is some ground or some way to re-subjectivize itself, right? On some basis. In the offshore China studies, the most common way this happens is people begin to fantasize themselves as being kind of post-national, and they're uniquely post-national, unlike Chinese, who are bound by their particularistic nationalism. So that gives people, and this can include ethnic Chinese, but they're now sutured to the position of global China studies, which is also then sutured to the position of whiteness. Then they can imagine themselves as equidistant from Sinocentrism and Eurocentrism, and then they're uniquely qualified to critique the two. And what gets covered up in that is that there's an actual historical relation in the development of Chinese nationalism. And I really disagree. The worst example would be somebody like Frank Zicotter, who wrote a book early in his career, The Discourse of Race in Modern China, where he wanted to show that Chinese have been racist since the beginning of history, just like us. Which is wrong on many different levels. So Chinese nationalism has a genealogy. It's important to get a handle on that genealogy. It's important to understand in that genealogy how it is fundamentally related. Cultural nationalism of a partially colonized and then post-colonial population is fundamentally related to imperial nationalism. And that requires understanding what imperial nationalism is, which is usually the one place that the people in China studies never really want to go. Naoki Sakai has written extensively about imperial nationalism, the imperial nationalism of Japan when it was an empire, and then the transferential relation between Japan and the United States in the post-war era, and how the United States then developed a very similar form of imperial nationalism. And it's a lot of the nationalisms in East Asia, not just Chinese nationalism, but Korean nationalism, are developed in a relationship to U.S. imperial nationalism that Naoki Sakai calls co-figuration. And it's a fascinating approach, and it might be very, very helpful for the kind of work that you're looking at. In terms of literature, I really wish, I mean, then we would want to talk about the whole problem of the whole problem of aesthetic modernity and the logic of exemplarity, the aesthetic logic of exemplarity. That was a central concern for Chinese authors, revolutionary authors like from Fredric and Moulin, and also philosophers like Cai who developed quite sophisticated theories of figuration and hence exemplarity. Fully aware of the political ramifications, and some of these figures were actually in the context of fighting a global war against fascism, right? Which could be a very important source of resources for what's coming up soon enough.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Professor. So there is another question from our student in the China Studies program, Halim, and he cannot turn on the microphone, so I'll just read his question. Do you believe that translation is playing a Eurocentric role by rendering non-Western cultures into Western narratives? If yes, what kind of approaches in translation should be opted to change this situation, or can it be changed for better at all, as it might cause non-understandable translations in target cultures?
Yeah, wow, that's a really big question. And I think I've been really inspired in my answer to that question by the work of Naoki Sakai, his theorization of translation, and deals with how to avoid a Eurocentric approach in thinking about translation. And part of that for him consists in a critique of some of the dominant ideas of translation, which are based, I think one of the dominant schools today would be the School of Cultural Transference, that sees translation as a form of, transferring ideas and things and stuff from one place to another, called cultural transfer. And what Sakai points out is that idea of cultural transference is based on certain presuppositions that are themselves based on hidden operations of translation. Now, those presuppositions are usually, he begins with presuppositions about the unity of a language. It assumes that languages are unity. And it's this unity, this quality of the unity of a language that makes it possible to demarcate the boundary between one language and another, and hence the transfer across that boundary from one language to the cultural sphere of another language. So what Sakai does is he goes and says, no. When you think about it, this doesn't work at all, because in order to set up these spheres, unitary linguistic spheres, there's some sort of operations that you need to go through, conceptual operations that you need to go through in order to assure yourself that these are, viable categories. And he shows that these operations basically amount to forms of translation that are not recognized as such. So there's a kind of pre-translation that's going on before translation. What this enables him to do then is to re-theorize translation, not in terms of that one of the typical metaphors, not the only, but one of the typical metaphors used about translation, which is constructing a bridge between linguistical cultural sphere A and linguistical cultural sphere B, and then translation makes a bridge. Instead, what Sakai shows is that, whoa, actually, there's this operation of translation that's creating the two sides that then you think you need to go and bridge between them. And so he radicalizes the whole translational situation. And that has some pretty interesting ramifications for how we think about culture, subjectivity, knowledge, especially when we're starting to look at history. I strongly recommend going and engaging with his work on that subject.
Okay, Thank you. If you don't mind, we have another question.
Sure.
From Eloisa. Yeah, please.
Eloisa, yes.
Exactly.
This question may be a bit off topic. I wanted to ask if you think that the recent issue where a lot of high-end European and American brands have been discovered to make their products in China instead of in their own country, which is what they claimed, and then adding just finishing touches, if this could be like a point, like a turning point for the perception of China as a whole, because not only it connected like international customers with Chinese factories directly, but it also showed just how much propaganda surrounds China, because all these products were thought to be extremely well crafted because they were made in the US or in Europe, but it was discovered that they were made in China. And there's this stigma about products made in China, that they're cheap, that they're not well made, that they're like bad quality. Do you think it's like socially, I don't know how much academically, but at least for the public?
Sure, that's definitely contributing to a reassessment that, you know, I think the 小红书 phenomenon is part of, right? Is it enough to change the image of China? I'm not sure. I'm very skeptical and very pessimistic. That is such a highly organized, industrialized effort, the effort to criminalize China. And it's now on so many different fronts. You know, I mean, I spend in one of my courses, graduate level, I spend more than half the semester talking about academic discussion of the so-called Chinese debt trap. And then what's quite interesting is that when you get into it, it's a little bit boring and dry and kind of technical, but when you get into it, you can actually see why they've created this narrative of Chinese debt trap. Because most debt, most global debt, is held by private bondholders based in the West. Paris, London, Frankfurt, New York. And in all of the negotiations about global debt that took off, especially after the pandemic, the private bondholders have always been excluded. The private bondholders say, no, we're, you know, this doesn't concern us. You states and international, you can talk about this amongst yourselves, but it doesn't concern us. Which is basically how the neo-colonial extraction of wealth by private Western financial houses in Africa proceed. And so that's what they're trying to cover up. Because they don't want this, because China has time and time again in negotiations has suggested, well, sure, we'll talk about global debt relief, we'll talk about global debt restructuring, we'll talk about our lending practices, but you got to get the private bondholders involved in this, and the private bondholders have to take a loss. It's called a haircut. Okay, so I go through that. I spend half a semester talking about that stuff. And then and everybody gets it. They're like, wow, you know, this is all just a big propaganda thing, you know, in the West. I mean, they're saying Chinese debt trap, Chinese debt trap. And then on the final exam, I ask a question about it. And like, I don't know, I mean, 60% of the answers is like, China is doing this, making these traps with poor, unsuspecting third world countries that then get trapped and then become vassal states of the People's Republic of China. And I try to, you know, I'm trying to, I don't know why that happened. Maybe you know why that happened. But I mean, it's just, the only thing I can say is it looks to me like there's just such an overwhelming tsunami, flood of negative propaganda about China, criminalizing China. It's not a problem. But let's look at what's being said about China. China is a genocidal criminal state, right? Child labor, forced labor, genocide, state repression, violent state repression. As far as I can see, it looks like this is all preparation for the war, in which China will have been thoroughly excluded from humanity, or at least some part of China, the Chinese state, will have been thoroughly excluded from humanity, so that therefore any kind of violence can be used against China. This is the post-war U.S. policy. So I'm not sure. I mean, I do see among my students like a kind of growing admiration and fascination for the accomplishments of the Chinese developmental state and developmental capitalism. You know, Chinese cities now have things that you won't see in any city in collect class. I mean, stuff that is, you know, in one sense, in a kind of craft technological sense, much more advanced. And things work. Things work. Whereas in the West, everything's falling apart. It's amazing. Things are really falling apart. And yet, in the West, in general, people still are bathed in this propaganda, think of the West as still superior. So,
Okay, thank you so much. We don't have more questions, but I think it would be a great pity if I end this session without asking you some kind of questions in Chinese, because sometimes I even think Professor Solomon's Chinese is even more native than English. 所以我要用中文问您一个最后的问题，然后我们的学生中国研究的，他们到现在这个第2年应该中文都蛮好的，应该也可以听得懂我们在讲什么。其实最后这边我就想问您一个稍微总体性的问题，也是一个我一直都很想知道的问题。因为您非常厉害在批判这一块，批判很多现有的东西，现有的理论，这也是我们的基本工作。但是您也知道，我们在进入这个后现代理论之后，所有的批判好像都会归于一种虚无，就是归于一种解构之后，但没有新的建构，任何你新建构起来的解决办法也好，或者是某种美好的愿望或者理想主义也好，都会被再次解构掉。特别是当您刚才提到一些比如说少数民族问题等等，这种问题从一开始在认知上面就非常的难达成一致。一方面非常难去同意西方说的那种 colonial theory， 对吧，或者 Sinophone 什么的，但是另外一方面又不得不承认，在少数民族问题上，可能 Sinophone包括少数民族的部分跟 Anglophone Francophone 还是有更相像的地方，就比如说跟台湾、马来这些比起来的话，可能少数民族是更相像的。所以我就觉得好像这个问题跟民族国家体系其实是非常相关的。然后我就想给大家读一下我觉得非常 insightful 的，就非常有启发的您的书的最后一段，就是左翼的败北这本书最后一段，您有提到说，在以主权国家为单位的国际体系里，包括分离的权益在内的民族自决权与边境不可侵犯的自主权之间无法化约的矛盾，其实就是各种极其暴力的生命权利丛生的温床。I will just provide a brief translation because this is really important and really insightful. In the international system structured around sovereign states, the irreducible contradiction between the right to national self-determination, including secessionist claims, and territorial sovereignty has become a breeding ground for proliferating forms of extremely violent biopower. So in a way, I also come to this conclusion, but in the very end of this paragraph of the book, you basically point out that only reflecting on the nation state is not enough. It's not enough to just point out that it is a historical construction or a imagined community, but we have to go back to the bordering practices and capital, things like that. 但是我觉得好像到最后这本书很多的批判已经提供给我们，我觉得都非常的锋利，但是最后还是归结于一个比较模糊的点。所以您对这个国族建构的一个态度是什么呢？我们是否就是去说把它全部都拆散，这是您的一个理想主义的愿望吗？还是说您觉得这种拆散不过也只是一种无尽的去殖民化？您之前也在别的地方提过这个想法，对吧？ Infinite decolonization, which you think is just another form of balkanization, is just another excuse to break up China, for example, enemy states like China. So how do we actually deal with this concept of the nation state? 就是这个国族这个概念，我们要怎么去处理它？在实际的操作层面，您觉得是可以在人类的某一个未来去将它取消的吗？还是说在比较保守的或者是比较实际主义这样子的一个态度出发，我们还是要在它的这个框架里面去做批判？所以你就不能去批判比如说一些国族内部的问题，因为你批判非西方国家内部的问题，永远会回到巩固西方所固定的这种国族边界。对，这是一个可能很模糊的问题，但是也是我一直读您的作品，每次都会有类似的疑问，读到最后就会觉得 everything is very critical, but what do we do with it? What is the solution?
你提的问题就特别大。
您就可以随便提供一下您对一些国族这个议题的想法是什么都可以。对，
听起来就是希望我可以临时提出一个未来的具体蓝图的蓝本，但我可能就一直没有办法讲的这么详细，反而从我自己的这个有限的这个位置来出发，因为毕竟是学者，在学术机构工作，我很多其他实务经验我也缺乏，所以我尽量在指出，在人文学这一块，或是人文科学这一块，怎么样的重组过程应该搭配地缘政治上一个类比性的、同时并行的一个重组过程。那我的问题 ，OK， 所以我基本上就是在说，我们应该彻底放弃以区域为人文学、人文科学的主要的组织原理，因为一直到现在，区域一直都是人文学的主要的组织原理。那这个区域的概念是来自哪里？所以我就要去推动一个谱系，一个系谱。然后同时我还要去指出跟所谓现实世界从殖民主义到现在世界的演变，两者之间的关联息息相关。因为在像我刚才做的这个讲义当中，我相信在座的各位都至少可以掌握这一点，就是我认为如果我们讲到一个什么叫做区域部署，或者是区域与人种差异部署 ，the apparatus of area and anthropological difference 的话，那它是横跨一个所谓现实的部分、世界的部分跟一个知识的部分。所以我在这个左翼败北之后的那本书叫 Sexual Transition 内因转型，我花了很多时间去同时追寻这两个不同的轨道，然后就刚好台湾今天的台湾就让至少 我个人觉得可以让我们看得非常清楚，这个一个学术领域如何参与了一个政治实体造就的过程。对，所以它并不是处于一种事不关己的立场，或是一种纯粹客观有距离的立场，他是参与者。今天的台湾，对我来说完完全全是离岸中国研究的产物。离岸中国研究一直到全球中国研究，必须在今天的台湾，第一要认出它的历史上的贡献，而这个贡献只可以有褒贬的成分。然后我在今天的这个讲义当中，我比较勾勒出来的算是比较负面的部分。然后它还有一个，我认为还有一个，除了这个贡献的部分之外，它还有一个责任，而这个责任它就一直到现在就没有人去承认。所以你做具体，我能做的具体就是从区域研究这一块切入，去主张整个人文学的一个重组，其中一个重组的过程。后来 ，OK， 那这个重组的过程，在我的乌托邦式的理想世界当中，应该搭配现实世界另外一种重组的过程。但是后来我做了更多的思考，特别应该说应该就是差不多从2020开始，做更多的思考，在目前的世界，从殖民主义到现在，帝国主义到现在，我觉得有一点必须承认的，就是边界，无论是实体边界还是抽象的边界，边界的变更，边界的重划，是一个举动无法想象的暴力的可能性的事。对，这个我一旦承认这一点的话，我就开始觉得必须稍微谨慎。这个是一个可能需要更长的时间去落实的一个计划。
Okay.
甚至
Thank you.
甚至是不是应该说，在联合国其实它是有这样子的一个在它的章程里面，就是基本上边界国界不能变更，不能变更。那但是当然，以现在这个我们从殖民主义继承下来的现有的这个世界版图，如果我们说所有的国界都不能动，这个当然就带来包含很多不正义在里面，因为国界有包含很多历史上的正义，对不对？但是讲的具体一点，如果我们假设的话，假设中国的边界要重划，现在中国边界要重划，我们能想象那个后果会怎么样吗？那个后果会非常严重。这个是我没有看过那些在这个全球中国研究圈去批评中国中央政府在新疆所干的丑事，根据他的理解，根据他的理解， 我从来没有看过他们去面对，是在他们的场合上，而且我没有亲身参与，但是我看过很多在线上，没有人提过像你刚才提过的这个问题，就说好啊，今天我们就让新疆独立出来啊，让新疆变成一个独立国家，那之后呢，会怎么样呢？我这从来没有听过他们，我现在很笼统讲，去针对这个问题，因为从我的角度来看，这个必定带来极大的不稳定，而且是非常暴力。我不是说中央政府对新疆怎么样，而是说整个一旦我们了解整个中亚这个地区，因为这个是全球来讲，中亚是最后一个独立出来成为独立主权国家的世界区域，比非洲还晚，是苏联解体之后才开始，对不对？所以短几十年。
好，那非常感谢，这个答案也是 very fitting. You started from Taiwan, then you came back to the minority region issue. I guess the answer to the nation state question is just like Taiwan itself. Some things it's a nation state, some don't, obviously. So with that ambiguity, I guess we have to invite you back to sometime to talk something more. I hope there will be such a chance if you are ever back in East Asia. Yeah, please let me know, and we can invite you back for a even more intensive offline session. That would be more productive. Really, compared to the previous 10 lectures we've done in this series, yours really generated the most insightful questions and intensive engagement from the students, and mostly also because our students are just getting more and more excellent. Anyways, okay, thank you so much, and we have kept you for 2 hours even though you were late. So wow, thank you for the extra work, and I hope everyone have learned a lot from this lecture, and we will conclude here, and so thank you so much.
Flair, and thanks to everybody for your participation in your event. 后会有期。
谢谢，晚安。那我们
晚安。
之后再见，谢谢。
好，拜拜。